City by the time you are viewing this. Pray for us as we are with all of our
Okay, well,
youth
we want to
on a
say welcome to
fantastically planned
everyone.
choir
I
and
am
mission trip
now in New
we
York City
are
by the
getting
time
in
you are
store
viewing
for
this.
a real
Pray
treat
for us
today
as we are with
in
all of
welcoming
our youth
Reverend
on a
Dr. Jeremy
fantastically
Williams
planned
with us
choir and
to
mission
our
trip. But
program.
we are
Going
in
to lead us in
store
a little
for a
Bible
real
study
treat
this morning.
today
I'm very,
in
very excited
welcoming
about that.
Reverend Dr.
Dr.
Jeremy
Williams has
Williams with
become a
us
colleague
to
over the
our
last year,
program. Is going
and
to
I
lead
know
us
that
in a
the
little Bible study
congregation
this
is
morning. I'm very,
anticipating
very
a
excited about that.
successful and
Dr. Williams has
inaugural
become a
rector
colleague
of the
over the last
Center for
year.
Theology and
As I've said
Justice.
to the congregation, he is
Wow,
the
he
assistant
is an
professor of New
amazing
Testament
scholar.
and the inaugural director of the Center for Theology and Justice. Um, wow, he is an amazing scholar, friends, and I'm very excited that he's going to come and teach us a little today. He has a BA from Vanderbilt University, an MDiv from Yale Divinity School, and a PhD from Harvard University. So this guy is educated, and even more than that, I can just tell how deeply he has embodied the message and meaning of the movement of Jesus. And I first encountered Dr. Williams, of course, upon his arrival here to Fort Worth about a year and a half ago, but then found him leading a Bible study online for Ebenezer Baptist Church, which was, of course, Dr. King's church in Atlanta, and is now the church for Reverend Dr. Senator Raphael Warnock. And I think some segment of what Dr. Williams is going to be doing today was a part of that. And I'm very, very much looking forward to it. And I wish to welcome you, Dr. Williams. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Uh,
Thank
we're,
you for
we're,
having me, Pastor Price. I'm glad to be
uh,
here. I'm honored.
we're truly honored. And I'm going to let you take this away, but I want to say something real briefly about your book, Criminalization in Acts of the Apostles, Race, Rhetoric, and the Prosecution of an Early Christian Movement. I'm going to let you take this away, but one thing I loved about this is just at the beginning, you'll see, first of all, Dr. Williams, how marked up this book is for me. This is a fantastic biblical scholarship, but I love the beginning where the first thing you do is you acknowledge the church in which you were raised, including your Mima, your grandmother. And I just thought that was incredible. So we're not only getting someone who was trained at Harvard Divinity School, Harvard University, but also someone who was trained by Mima as well. So I think
That's right.
we are going to be blessed today, and I just welcome you.
Oh, thank you so much. And before I get into what I have to share, I just want to share with you, Pastor Price, and with the congregation how much I treasure our friendship and the work that you are doing in Fort Worth and beyond. That to be able to come in and to take leadership and to bring different congregations together and to raise issues of justice and to show how these are compatible with the gospel and the movement of Jesus, I think it's really admirable. Especially to not just do it like we do sometimes in academic spaces, but to actually make this come alive in a congregation, come alive at the county commissioner's court, come alive in the streets of Tarrant County and Fort Worth in particular. So thank you for that, and I'm grateful to know you, and I look forward to knowing you and being in a relationship for a long time.
Amen to that. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I don't want to make you all glad I came and glad I'm gone. And so I think in the time we have together, I have some really exciting things to share. And so I'll share my screen. As Pastor Price has already mentioned, I'm an Acts scholar, and I spend a lot of time thinking about Acts. And, we often think about Acts as the beginning of the church and marking its origins. And so I want to talk about Acts Church today. I want to talk about it in a particular way. I want to talk about it as a movement that gets in the way. Acts Church is a movement that gets in the way.
Mm.
So the way that I think about this is really connected to this Hebrew word term hey hadas. It's used across the book of Acts, and often it's translated as the way. Um, Scholars like myself, we like to translate it as the movement, and even our translation, we'll see it as the way. It's a really rich term. It's seen in Acts 9, Acts 19, chapter 22, 24. It is Acts' most choicest way to describe the people in the movement of Jesus. It doesn't really use Christian. As a matter of fact, every time the term Christian is used in the book of Acts, it's used in a negative or pejorative way, where a group is using it from the outside to denigrate the people who are part of the hey hados of Jesus, this movement, journey, pathway. When Pastor Price was talking about my book, he noted me recognizing Meemaw, but also it's dedicated to our little girl Journey. And as you can see, there's some connection here between how I see how hey hados, the movement, the way, the journey, which also captures a piece of John 14:6 when Philip asked Jesus to show him the hey hada, show him the way. And Jesus responds saying, "You're looking for the way, but I am the way. I am hey hados. I'm the journey, the path." And so Jesus is inviting people on a journey. And Acts shows us this idea of journey and movement because from the very beginning in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, you see the programmatic thesis for the book to go from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the uttermost parts of the world. And so the book is about movement. It's about getting in a movement. It's about becoming a part of this way, this journey. And so when I say Acts is a church that gets in the way, I mean that in a couple of ways. The first is, if, as we noted, Jesus is the way. And so it's to get into Jesus's movement and program. It also represents that it's a journey, it's a place to go. And also, we talk about how sometimes when you're part of the way, the church has an opportunity to even get in its own way. And so, as we think about the way as this malleable term and as the most popular term for how the writer of Acts talks about the early Jesus following community, I put a lot of emphasis on way because as we think about this term, it allows different opportunities. As I mentioned, movement. In my book, which Pastor Price noted, I translated as movement every time there, particularly to show how the earliest Jesus followers were not just proto clergy building churches that were going to have glass chandeliers and stained glass windows with padded pews, but they were a part of a movement that made Roman officials concerned, a movement that made other people who were religious concerned about what they were doing. And that's how Acts portrays them as a part of this movement that people are suspicious of. And so that leads me to ask a number of questions as we think about what it means to be hey hawdos. Here is a sign from when I was in Greece, and they actually use the term exodus to refer to exits on roads. It's the way out. It's the journey out, the way out, the exit, the exhod. That's what the top word is exodus, the name of the second book in Christian Bible. And so thinking about it as the way, as the movement, that can impact how we think about the characters that we find in Acts and what their chronic imprisonments help us to see about the ancient world and ways that we can read Acts in conversation with people who are criminalized, incarcerated, and othered in our contemporary society. And so if you noticed, again, when Pastor Price mentioned the title of my book, it's Criminalization, Acts of the Apostles, Race, Rhetoric, and the Prosecution. And I note prosecution rather than persecution because you see here on your screen that I have the word dikaios. Jesus is the just one, but he is sentenced to a criminal's death, and that happens not outside of the power structures and centers of the Roman world in Jerusalem, which was the capital of sorts of Judea, but it happened in full alignment with the powers that be. It's not separate. It's a component of it. And so I lean into saying prosecuted to help us to see how systems and structures of judicial practices and policies render certain people's bodies and render them as criminal. That this project is always a subjective project. It's not, I think sometimes we imagine that criminals just exist. Everybody knows what a criminal is, but part of what legitimates them are the structures and the people in authority who determine which activities, which people should be viewed or understood as criminal. And to that end, the earliest Jesus follower movement that we see in Acts, for all intents and purposes, is viewed as criminal and gets not persecuted by religious fanatics, but is prosecuted by actual religious leaders, political leaders, civic leaders, imperially empowered folk. And so in this passage, a very familiar passage in Acts 9:1-4, some people may even have it by heart, that while Saul, still breathing threats of murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, remember Hey Hadas there, the movement, the way, the journey, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Notice that I have this underlined in bold and italicized. He asked, who are you, Lord? The reply came, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. The Greek word and phrase here is ti me diokes. Why do you prosecute? And I wanted to capture this so you could see the Greek here, to see that within the semantic range of the word dioko, it can mean persecute as we traditionally have rendered it, but it can also include prosecute. And prosecute makes a lot of sense when we think about, and I'll come back to that slide in a moment, when we think about how the attack against the Jesus followers in Acts are not extrajudicial, but they are in line with the way that criminal systems, judicial processes are actually working. And that's important for us to remember when we start to think about Jesus and the disciples when they are chronically getting, as we would say, persecuted. We often say, well, they were spreading the gospel. So they were spreading the gospel. People didn't like it. And so they were received all types of bad treatment for spreading the gospel. But I think there's another set of questions that we can think about if we don't just try to turn these into martyrs for the good news, but if we use these texts like Acts and other ancient texts, biblical texts and otherwise, as tools to get a glimpse into the ancient world, into its ancient judicial processes and the imagination that people in the 2nd century, which is about when Acts was written, how they would have understood how courts and prisons and the law and sheriffs and governors, how those different officials would have registered in their imagination. And so to kind of help us to shake away from some of our what we call embedded theologies, the ways that we've often have read Acts and think about it, and to kind of like do some of the historical and theoretical work that I'm inviting us to do, I want to invite us to look at an exhibit that was presented as a final project by one of my students at Bright named Annie Wildy. And in this exhibit, she calls it Jesus is Not Your Martyr, building off of a documentary on James Baldwin called I'm Not Your Negro. And in this exhibit, she invites us to reimagine Jesus in light of our conversation around prosecution versus persecution. So here she presents this image of Jesus. We're often kind of, our theological imaginations present him as being chosen by God, God's Son, to suffer on the cross in theological ways, often for substitutionary atonement purposes. But what happens when we think about Jesus as one who was a threat to the Roman government And so the reason why he's crucified is not only about atonement or about those particular types of theological concerns, but it's also a way for us to think about Jesus as a representative of people who are troublemakers for empire, people who cause issues, people who um, uh, judicial systems and systems of order and domination might not want to see as a part of what they're doing. And so part of why I invite us to like what she did here is it allows us to think about Jesus often presented as meek and mild and mistreated, but here we get to see potential image of Jesus as someone who made people in power uncomfortable. And so they found ways to get rid of him. And so here she draws attention to this notion between prosecution over persecution, to think about why one type of translation is chosen over another. Really quickly, I like to always mention everywhere that it's really helpful to learn the languages or read multiple translations, because translation is itself a form of interpretation. That when somebody is translating for us, they already are making decisions on our behalf. And so that's one of the reasons why I lean into, even in the title of my book, to talk about prosecution, to kind of help to reshift the way we even think about early Christian history, the way that we think about the Jesus movement. What happens when we go from thinking about this as a group of monks and instead see it as a criminal element, as a potential group of folks that the Romans would have seen as a gang, as thugs? What happens with who we can show solidarity and sympathy with when we can see this in Acts? And one of the most powerful elements of this presentation is leaning into a liberation theology approach that forces us to not just focus on the fact that Jesus was crucified, but it reminds us to pay attention to all of the other people who are still on crosses. And so part of what we see in the name of Jesus here, and we can zoom in, are the names of folks, Black and brown people, including names like Martin Luther King and, of course, George Floyd, who were victims of state violence directly or indirectly. And to see Jesus' name in alignment with these, showing solidarity with these folks, helps us to see how thinking with prosecution, thinking about with people legitimizing who is worth life, who is not, helps us to think about some aspects of Acts, especially the passage that we were just thinking about in Acts 9, where there you find Jesus. Before I go there in Acts 9, where we find Paul actually getting an arrest warrant. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But when we think about Jesus in conversation with folks like the names presented here, what we discover is that we read passages like Luke 4 differently. And for those of my Bible scholars who are in the audience who are watching, you know that Luke and Acts are probably written by the same author. Luke is the prequel to Acts of sorts, or it's the first volume, and Acts is the second. And so in line with that, when we think about the Jesus who we find commissioning Saul and the disciples in Acts, who is this Jesus, and how do we think about who that Jesus is? And I think that Luke 4, 16 through 19, to me, is a place where we see Jesus lay out who he thinks he is. We see Luke lay out how he wants Jesus to engage and interact. And here, Jesus is not here to be meek and mild and complicit with all of the systems of empire and domination, but no, he takes a passage from Isaiah 61 and says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And since Pastor Price said this is Bible study, I hope y'all don't mind me reading the Bible in Bible study and having some text in front of us. And it's a Baptist church. I got to use the Bible to make my claim in a Baptist church. And so here, this is what Jesus is about. But you can see easily how if Jesus is about doing this type of work, and the thing is, this isn't just something in the Gospels. He's picking this up from Second Isaiah to make a part of his work. So this is showing like a continuity of God's work in the world. That God's work is to bring good news to the poor and bring release to captives and to set free the oppressed. Now, if you notice here, one thing that I do, and I just want to throw this in for free, is that I have Lord capitalized. And this is because if you notice in a lot of Hebrew Bibles, in the Old Testament, what you find is that when you see Lord often, it's in small caps. And that's because it's representing the divine, unpronounceable name. And so it's a name that can be pronounced, and so they fill it in with other vowels in order to make it pronounceable. And so Lord or Kyrios is the Greek word used for it. And in order for me to kind of salvage the term Lord, and maybe if we have some time in the chat, I can say why there's some problems with it sometimes, especially in terms of domination. But rather than get into that, I've kind of developed this acronym to help me to be able to appreciate what Lord means in light of this passage and how I understand how God works. And so here's the acronym: the leader of our resistance to domination. And so in some ways this is really in line with Philippians 2, where Jesus thought not robbery, thought not a thing to be equal with the divine, right? And took upon himself the form of an enslaved person. So the kind of type of leader Jesus is not one that rises in power to put others down, but instead is one who actually frustrates the very notion of power, hierarchy, and domination by being in that space. And so to there, Jesus being exalted is also bringing down what it means to be a Lord. And in some ways, I see democratizing power, but that's not the act stuff today. But when I see Lord, I'm thinking about Jesus as the leader of our resistance to domination. Right. And that's what we are finding in Acts, I believe. So now when we go back to Acts and we see another passage to bring us in conversation back with the Acts 9 that we already looked at, I want us to note all the emboldened terms. I'll read it, but if we note the emboldened terms, I think you'll catch where I'm going. So the next day, their rulers, elders, and scribes assembled in Jerusalem with Annas, the high priest, Caiaphas, John, and Alexander, and all who were of the high priestly family. When they had made the prisoners stand in their midst, they inquired, by what power or by what name did you do this? Then Peter, filled with the Holy Spirit, said to them, rulers of the people and elders. They ordered them to leave the council. While they discussed the matters with one another, they said, what will we do with them? Okay. Now, I want you to note, what I emboldened here these are all people in power. As a matter of fact, one way to think of the word elders, which is kind of, some ways, a bit of a lazy translation because it misses that this is a governing body. And the reason I say it's a lazy translation because technically we have a body of elders in the United States too. That's what a senator is. Senatus is an elder. So it's the same type of governing kind of force. I think sometimes the distance between us prevents us from being able to see that this is a governmental structure. It's not just religious, even though the two are not often completely separated. But here we see that there is a religio, political, and economic faction that is getting in the way of the way. You see what I'm saying there? In the way of the way. You have Peter and those folks who are a part of the way, Jesus's movement. And here you have the rulers, the elders, the Jerusalem elite. Remember, I mentioned Jerusalem being the capital, is where the temple was, is where people brought taxes that would be transferred over to Rome. And so this is a significant place. And the high priestly family would not have been one who had been following the Aaronic descent, but it would have been appointed by the Roman governor. And in this case, we see Annas and Caiaphas, who were appointees of the Roman Empire. And so what we find in this passage is that these government officials, these representatives of Rome, are literally getting in the way of the way. Right. So the government their understandings of what's right and wrong, who they choose to criminalize, is actually standing directly up and against Jesus, who Acts calls the just one, right? So it's showing that the system that determines who is right, who's wrong, who should be criminalized, who's not, is itself corrupt. And that not only is it bringing Jesus' followers into judgment, this very system is the one that killed Jesus as a common criminal, enslaved person. So part of what's being brought into context here is how this Roman inflected set of powers are misidentifying God's movement in the world through God's people, because they are rendering these people as uneducated. So they've really, because they're uneducated, because they're foreigners, they're from Galilee, and here they are talking in Jerusalem, because they are following a particular understanding of religion that they don't agree to, that these people are criminals. How similar does that type of logic sound, especially in a state like this, where people, if they don't speak the same language, if they think differently with some different types of beliefs, if they're from another place that people in power have told us is dangerous, how often do we find ourselves not on the side of Jesus and the apostles, but on the side of the Jerusalem elite who were appointed by the Roman Empire, that was only concerned about its money and its status and not concerned about its people? And that gets into these ideas with the elders and the high priest, helps us then to come back to that Acts 9 that we looked at before. When Saul's breathing out threats, we see the high priest. Acts 4 tells us who the high priest was, Annas, right? Appointed by Rome. And so Paul asked for letters to the synagogues. He gets arrest warrants. He's not operating just out of some religious fervor. And sometimes when we think about the Synedrion or the group that's council in Jerusalem as only religious, we miss that it's religious, it's economic, it's political. And so that group is literally giving him warrants to arrest people and bring them back to Jerusalem bound, right? And so here, Paul himself is trying to get in the way of the way. And so if we think about Paul, we think about Paul as a persecutor. That's how we often translate that word, the kaios. But if he's getting arrest warrants, if he's fulfilling the criminal justice system's policies, then he's really prosecuting them. He's acting under the legal sanction of those in power. And so if he is doing that, how does this lead us to think about how the relationship between Jesus' followers and quote unquote justice systems? And what types of hermeneutic or approach to suspicion should we have when we see that sometimes the justice system gets it wrong? And here in Acts, they got it wrong really in the worst way. In Luke, they get it wrong with Jesus. And in Acts, they get it wrong with the apostles. And so, what this should lead us to do, it should lead us to consider, who do we align with? And how do we reconfigure and reconstruct the history of early Christianity, or Christianities, if you will? Should we just imagine that the descendants of those in Acts, those characters and protagonists, that their descendants are those who wear black robes or white albs? Or should we imagine their descendants could be those who wear orange jumpsuits? If we're getting in the way with Jesus, then we recognize that we have to get in the way with the kinds of people that Jesus got in the way with, right? And so, what does this look like? Abraham Smith, he's actually in the area, teaches at SMU, at Perkins School. And he brings up the scene in Acts 16. Y'all know Acts 16, when Paul and Silas are in Philippi and there's an enslaved girl with a Pythian spirit. They exercise that spirit, and then her owners, because they're upset they can't make a profit, they drag them to the town square, to the market, the agora, and they have the sheriffs there beat them, and then they are placed in jail. And here's how Abraham Smith helpfully describes that moment. He says, in one virtually breathless sentence, the narrative never focalizes on the actions of Paul and Silas. The fact that the magistrates, I translate that as sheriffs, but he says magistrates, were, and Pastor Price can see why sheriffs might be a useful a useful translation, the strategory, were in lockstep with the slave owners and the crowd, ostensibly in the name of good order, reveal structural form of violence. With the rush to ensure public safety, a rash judicial policy decision made no less in the proximate space of the agora, that's the marketplace, where defendants would normally have been examined, never opened up an opportunity in Luke's long sentence. For Luke, prisons do not fulfill that projected role because they repeatedly are drawn as places of official corruption and violence. When we just pay attention to that feature of Acts, where does it tell us we should be getting in alignment and in solidarity with today? If we want to line up where Paul and Silas would have been today, it's not just preaching like Paul and singing like Silas, but here we see they're placed in prison based off of a system that's broken and corrupt and against them. This sounds familiar, doesn't it? And these two books are influential in my thinking, and I'd advise you to get them as a part of ways to think about some of the larger, broader ideas that I've mentioned. And the reason why I bring Jennings here is Jennings, in reference to that Acts 16 moment, he makes the claim that I'm also making about how the criminalization of the Jesus followers has to be connected also to Jesus. And so I quote Willie Jennings in my book on page 191, and I mentioned what he says, that Jesus was not simply someone who got caught up in a judicial system, but the one who shattered its connection to morality and righteousness, because the righteous child of God was imprisoned. I'll read that one more time. It's one of those good things. I saw Dr. Jennings at a conference recently, and I told him, I said probably the best parts of my book are when I quote you. So let me let me say this again. Jesus was not simply someone who got caught up in a judicial system, but the one who shattered its connection to morality and righteousness, because the righteous child of God was in prison. And not only was he in prison, right? We know he received lethal punishment, crucifixion, execution by the Roman state. And part of what James Cone notes is that it is remarkable that Americans have not been able to draw parallels between the Roman cross that would have been used for enslaved people or folks proximate to them, the lowest type of punishment that people that the government could hand out, that was used as a way to publicly warn people that if you mess with the Romans, if you mess with our group, then this is your fate. He says it's remarkable that Americans have not been able to connect that to the same type of practice that happened centuries later on southern trees with strange fruit hanging on them, hence the cross and the lynching tree. And so he names this, and as I'm concluding my talk, I want to conclude this in the same way as I conclude my book, with this quotation from James Cone, that the real scandal of the gospel is this: humanity's salvation is revealed in the cross of the condemned criminal Jesus, And humanity's salvation is available only through our solidarity with the crucified people in our midst. This recognition, to me, it illustrates how the strange fruit of the prison industrial complex is linked to the strange fruit hung on southern trees, which must be linked to the strange fruit Roman officers hung on the cross at Golgotha, the strange fruit that Acts Messiah movement recognized as both the criminalized one and the just one. And so this work to me is important because it links both biblical history as well with U.S. history. And so when I went to the Equal Justice Institute's National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, my home state, I came across this quotation, and Pastor Price noted it because it's in the introduction of my book. And this quote struck me, and it's part of what animates my scholarship, my abolition sensibilities, and my work as a historian, as a preacher, as a thinker, is this work. Who is it for? It's for the hanged and beaten, for the shot, drowned, and burned, for the tortured, tormented, and terrorized, for those abandoned by the rule of law, and dare I even add, and those prosecuted by the rule of law as well. We will remember with hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice, with courage, because peace requires bravery, with persistence, because justice is a constant struggle, and with faith, because we shall overcome. And by putting these type of commitments together, it allows us to think about images like this, where Tatiana Jefferson, who was killed by the police here in this area, her name could have been in that name of Jesus from the exhibit I showed you before. And by thinking with Jesus in this way, recognizing, as Cone noted, that the cross of the condemned criminal Jesus reminds us to show solidarity with the crucified and criminalized people in our midst. Images like this help us to put together pieces, to reimagine and reconstruct the origins of Christian history so that we can tell a story that inspires us to resist domination, exploitation, and violence impacting lives as we follow the Lord, our leader of our resistance to domination, as we follow that Lord into paths that lead to justice, love, and wholeness. So in this way, since we're in a church setting, I'll close with a hymn. I'm Methodist, but I hope y'all don't mind. The question for us then, if we're going to be a church that gets in the way, is must Jesus bear the cross alone and all the world go free? No, there's a cross for everyone, and there's a cross for you and me. And so if we're going to be Acts Church that gets in the way, there's some solidarity that we need to show, but there is also some ways to rethink and reimagine so that we get in the way of Jesus, in the way with Jesus, and not get in the way to try to prevent Jesus from doing the work of liberation and abolishing systems that are criminalizing and crushing people. So again, thank you so much for our time. If you have questions, feel free to email me at jeremy.williams. I should have a slide for this. I never have a follow up with me slide. It's because I'm so interested in the presentation, I forget to say how to connect. But yes, jeremy.williams@tcu.edu. And thank you for your time, Pastor.
Wow, Dr. Williams, thank you so very much. I'm just sure that everyone in the room has a sense of the timeliness of this scholarship because of the way in which it really connects to the work that we are doing as a congregation in trying to be a church in the way, which is a profound framing of that language for which I'm very, very grateful. And I feel like you've come to our city at just the right time, and let no one say that Bright Divinity School is not teaching any Bible. Let me say that, because this is Bible. It may not be
Exactly.
Bible taught in the same way that maybe I was taught to read it at first, but I think it's very consistent with the early movement's understanding of what was taking place amongst the early followers of the way. So I have a question, actually maybe two questions I think we have
Yeah.
time for, and then there will be a chance for people to have engagement here in a moment, just in the room. But uh, can you just touch briefly? I want to ask two questions. One about the Center for Theology and
Yeah.
Justice, and then the other, you didn't mention the word liestes,
Yeah.
which is one of the things in which people are accused of in Acts. And would you just talk a little bit about what the accusations were in many ways, what they were being accused of in this
Yeah.
prosecution, and then also just tell us a little bit more broadly about your vision for the center, because I know people are going to be really interested in figuring out how we can be involved and be of support.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you for that. And yes, I spent a lot of time thinking about the lay style, and because this term is it's a really ambiguous term, as you know, and my students have learned, is that one thing I do is I like to trouble terms, because sometimes when we have them so stabilized that we miss that there were a lot of ways that ancient readers and others could have interpreted. And so in Acts 21, when Paul is in Jerusalem, um, there's a there's a tumultuous moment concerning whether or not who concerning his identity. And so the militarized police commander, Lysias, he comes down, and he swoops in, and Paul says, can I speak to you, and can I speak to the group? And Lysias says, wait, you know Greek? So you're not this Egyptian Laestes, right? You're not um, this term, often in our translation might say bandit. It's the term used in the two, um, I guess in Matthew and Mark. It's the term used to describe those next to Jesus. They're described
Yeah,
as
yeah.
Laestai. They are this term, and going
Next
back,
to
I was
Jesus
talking before I
when he was
talked.
being crucified.
Yeah, and when I we were talking before our call around about King James, it calls them, malefactors, right? Or thieves even. But like the term is ambiguous. Malefactor is just really a Latin composite that means male, bad, factor is doer, like evil doer, right? So it's not really tight what they are here. And so Paul is accused of being like an Egyptian Laestes, right? Well, we see in the Gospels, we see them as like people who like were kind of crucified with Jesus. In Luke's Gospel, the time when he uses the term, he uses it to refer to the folks who who attacked the man going from Jericho to Jerusalem, and who gets helped by the Good Samaritan. And so this man is attacked by Laestai, bandits, is how that term is used. And so in Acts 21, Paul is prejudicially identified by the militarized police commander as a Laestes, as a thief, bandit, criminal, and I translate it as thug to capture how ambiguous terms like this to say certain groups of people have criminal potential, even if they're not criminals yet. Because in that particular passage, not only does he say he's Egyptian, he says an Egyptian criminal, and we see like in other ancient writers like Josephus that they use the plasticity of a term like Laestes to say, well, he was just a thug, right? He was just a no good thug. That's why I don't like him, and that's why I kicked him out, or of course he committed this crime. Of course he did. He was born a thug, right? That's the kind of language that happened in antiquity. Hmm. There seems to be some similarities between castigating other people, say thugs, super predators, language, illegals, undocumented, right? It's a similar type of that group of people, a group of people that is prone to do something. And then Egyptian, of course, had several implications in antiquity around who around what Egyptians were known for, and some of those were not really positive. And so I spent a chapter there in my book talking about how very alive and ancient imaginations were these ambiguous imaginary groups of people who are just up to no good, and that since they're up to no good, that's what you need: strong imperial governors who protect and serve with their troops. You need them because there's this category of thugs that are coming to get your stuff. And here, they think that Paul is a thug. So, how do we wrestle with the Romans and the Roman government and governments like that getting it wrong, misidentifying humans as thugs or as criminals even before they do anything? And what implications does that lead to? And one of the implications in Acts is that Paul is under arrest from chapter 21 through 28. He's the book ends with him on house arrest. One scholar notes that it's probably the case that the writer of Acts wants us to remember Paul the prisoner more than Paul the preacher.
Wow. Wow.
What happens when we pay attention to the story? And to be fair, Pastor, we don't after Acts 21, we don't do a lot of preaching after. We might get to where he shakes the snake off in Malta, or the sermon
Yeah.
where, with Agrippa, you almost persuaded me. But with like 7 or so chapters where Paul is just in custody.
What does he say? Remember my chains.
Yeah,
That's one of the scriptures
yeah,
that he's writing. Okay, listen, I could sit here and just talk about the Bible and the way that it intersects with um, where we're at right now in the history of America, 2024, the history of Tarrant County. I would love to do that. We are going to have you back, but in just maybe 1 minute, can you give us a big picture of your hopes and plans for the Center for Theology and
yeah.
Justice? Right.
Thank you for remembering that, because that's really important. We are really excited to help people to think theologically and act justly. And so we've kicked off the center. We are in our first year. We had our first soft launch where we brought in the different program units to demonstrate how bright is living out into doing justice, whether it's our Black church studies, Jewish studies, our Carpenter Center for gender and sexuality, how Asian and Asian American Pacific Islanders, how I don't know why Bright is doing Acts work. Is that
All right.
and so the Center for Theology and Justice helps to hone that work and to invite the community in to do some of this work. We have community programs, like we had our major launch event where we had the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. We recently hosted a colloquium where we invited scholars to come and help our communities to think through how scripture, how theology, and how justice intersect in ways that are meaningful, not just for academics, but really for practitioners. Mm-hmm. We plan on having an organizer in residence this fall, and we are coordinating our scripture and civil rights travel seminar, where one of the sites we'll be going to is the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery. And so part of our work is help people to think theologically, act justly. And so we are building this program, and next spring we'll be having our follow-up to our launch event, where we plan on inviting major speakers and get the community to come out, so that part of what the Center for Theology Justice can be is a hub for people who are justice oriented, really here in the DFW area, bring them together. And for those who are inclined to theology, to help to show how these things are connected. And for those who aren't, to show them that they might find some counterparts, that all Christians are not the ones who they are seeing making a bad name for us on the news, that there are people who are committed toward demonstrating God's love, God's justice, and making the world more whole. And so those are the primary projects and work of the Center for Theology and Justice, and we're continuing to think about new offerings. And so please be in touch with us about ways to partner. And
That's
so that's more than
exciting.
2 minutes. But that's having to give a preacher the microphone again. I might start singing if you give me
Well,
more
Dr.
time.
Williams, I just want to say thank you. We've got a lot of folks who are current and prospective Bright Divinity School students, and I am sure that our time together has excited even more interest. So I just wish to say thank you. I want to remind the congregation that next week on the 21st, we will have Ms. Chantel Taylor, whose son, Kyrie Campbell, was detained at the Tarrant County Jail. He's a 22-year-old with something of like an 8-year-old's intellectual ability. And because of the advocacy work done by Broadway and several other community organizations, he was recently released on grounds of humanitarian care. And I'm just very, very pleased about this. And we're excited. It's good to share a victory when something like that happens. And so Ms. Taylor will be with us, a wonderful human being. And I think it just coincides very well with the work that has been presented today. So Dr. Williams, thank you. Thank you for your scholarship, for your love for God, for God's people, and for getting in the way. God bless you.
Bless you. Peace.
Wonderful. So thank you for coming out today. Many of us have to head out to get set up for worship, but if you're able to stay and like to let's kind of gather in the center of the room and we can have some discussion. The live stream, those of you joining us on live stream, thank you. So the live stream portion will end at this time. But for those of us here in person, I wanted to open it up. If you'd like to stay, just share with your table what was the number one thing that's going to stick with you from today's lecture.